Welcome to the channel, my alien friends. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy listening. The sleek diplomatic shuttle sliced through the atmosphere of Axion, its metallic surface gleaming beneath the planet's twin suns. From the viewport, Jace Torin watched as the alien landscape unfolded below him. Endless valleys of shimmering green rock and strange crystalline formations rising like spires into the sky. There was something both beautiful and ominous about Axion, a place that seemed caught between the grandeur of an ancient empire and the threat of isolation. Jace leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his unruly dark hair. His lips curved into a slight grin as the ship's automated voice announced their impending landing. Approaching Axion Central Spaceport, prepare for landing, Ambassador Torin. Ambassador. Jace chuckled softly to himself, the title still feeling alien on his tongue. He was a diplomat, sure, but one who rarely stuck to the polished rules of diplomatic protocol. His charm, sharp wit, and disregard for rigid structures had gotten him this far, and now it was time to see if those same traits would work on one of the most closed-off, traditionalist species in the galaxy. The shuttle's landing gear touched down with barely a whisper. Jace straightened his jacket, exhaling slowly. The fate of human-Axion relations was in his hands, and though the mission was political on the surface, Jace had a feeling it was about to become much more personal. The hatch opened, and a rush of hot, humid air washed over him. As he stepped onto the ramp, Jace blinked against the intensity of the twin sun's light. The air carried a strange, intoxicating scent, sweet and metallic, like a flower blooming amidst molten iron. He adjusted his collar and descended, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence of the spaceport. Waiting for him at the bottom of the ramp was the Axion delegation. Tall, silent figures stood like statues, their blue, luminescent skin shimmering in the light. They were imposing, to say the least, each one at least 8 feet tall, their bodies encased in ceremonial armor that pulsed faintly with energy. Their pupilless eyes, cold and alien, studied him with unnerving intensity. Jace's grin widened, masking the small spike of unease he felt as he approached the leader of the group. Ambassador Torin, the tallest of the Axions, intoned, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. I am High Counselor Zevrak. Welcome to Axion. Jace inclined his head, careful to avoid direct eye contact, a sign of aggression in Axion culture, according to his briefings. The pleasure is mine, High Counselor. I look forward to strengthening the bonds between our worlds. Zevrak's expression remained impassive, but his eyes lingered on Jace, searching. The human ambassador couldn't tell if it was distrust, amusement, or something else entirely, but he could feel the weight of the counselor's scrutiny. Zevrak's presence was commanding, and there was no question why he held power on this world. Follow me, Zevrak said curtly, turning with a flick of his long cloak. The other Axions fell into step behind him, and Jace followed, his curiosity growing with each passing moment. As they moved through the spaceport, Jace marveled at the architecture. Crystalline structures jutted from the ground, glowing softly with an inner light, as though the planet itself was alive and breathing. The technology was advanced beyond anything Jace had ever seen, yet it was woven seamlessly with the natural landscape. It was both futuristic and organic, an aesthetic that spoke of a civilization that had mastered both nature and technology. The spaceport was bustling with activity, though Jace noticed immediately that the only non-Axion presence was his own. Humans and other alien species were nowhere to be seen. Axion had closed itself off from the galaxy for centuries, refusing almost all contact with outsiders, which made his presence here even more remarkable. But it also meant that tensions were high, and every step he took felt like walking on a knife's edge. As they neared the exit, a sudden commotion caught Jace's attention. A group of Axions had gathered near one of the side corridors, their voices raised in what could only be described as an argument. At the center of the dispute stood a woman, her height even more impressive than the others, her skin adorned with intricate swirling patterns that seemed to pulse in time with her emotions. Her presence was commanding, her stormy gray eyes radiating defiance as she faced off against the group. What's going on over there? Jace asked, his curiosity piqued. High Counselor Zevrak shot him a glance, his lips thinning in disapproval. Nothing that concerns you, Ambassador. That is Kaya Zalara, my daughter. She has unconventional ideas about Axion's place in the galaxy. Jace raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Unconventional, you say? Sounds like my kind of person. Zevrak's eyes narrowed dangerously, and his voice dropped to a low growl. I would advise caution, Ambassador Torin. Axion politics are not for outsiders to meddle in. Jace held up his hands in a placating gesture, his usual mischievous grin playing at the corners of his mouth. No offense meant, Counselor. I was just admiring the local architecture. The tall counselor gave him a lingering look, one that promised consequences if Jace overstepped his bounds, but said nothing more. As they continued walking, Jace's mind lingered on the woman, Kaya. There had been something about her, a fire in her eyes, a defiance that felt all too familiar. In a world where everyone seemed to follow a rigid set of rules, she stood out. And Jace, never one to play by the rules, couldn't help but feel an instant connection to that rebellion. His arrival ceremony was a blur of formality. There were grand speeches from the High Council, stiff introductions, and polite nods. Jace played his part, smiling and offering diplomatic pleasantries, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Kaya. Something about her called to him, a force of nature in this alien world of rigid tradition. She embodied the kind of change he had come to Axion to ignite, and he could feel the undercurrent of tension that seemed to hum through the air whenever her name was mentioned. As the ceremony came to a close and the Axion dignitaries began dispersing, Jace was cornered by a group of counselors eager to pepper him with questions. Most were skeptical, their curiosity about Earth thinly veiling their distrust of humans. "Is it true that your people require sleep every single day?" one asked, his tone incredulous. Jace grinned, leaning in conspiratorially. "Oh, it's worse than that. Some of us even take naps." The group exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether to believe him. Jace was about to launch into a humorous explanation of human siestas when a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Are you always this flippant with alien dignitaries, Ambassador Torin, or am I witnessing a special performance?" Jace turned to see Kaya standing behind him, one elegant eyebrow arched in challenge. Up close, she was even more striking. Her gray eyes seemed to hold entire galaxies, and there was a magnetic intensity in her gaze. Jace had to crane his neck to meet her eyes, but he didn't mind one bit. "Only on days that end in Y," Jace quipped, his grin widening. "And please, call me Jace. Ambassador makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and frowning a lot." Kaya's lips twitched, the barest hint of amusement breaking through her composed exterior. "Very well, Jace. I hope you're prepared for the negotiations ahead. The High Council isn't known for its sense of humor." "Good thing I brought enough for everyone," Jace shot back, his eyes twinkling with mischief. The disapproving stares of the surrounding counselors didn't faze him. There was something electric in the air between him and Kaya, a spark that hadn't ignited in years of playing the diplomatic game. Kaya leaned in, her voice dropping to a low murmur that sent a shiver down Jace's spine. "Be careful, Jace. Axion politics can be treacherous, especially for outsiders who don't know how to watch their step." Before Jace could respond, Kaya straightened and addressed the group in a louder voice. "If you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to. Ambassador Torin, I look forward to seeing you at the negotiations." With that, she glided away, leaving Jace standing in the midst of the counselors, his mind whirling. Something told him that this mission was going to be far more dangerous and far more exhilarating than he had ever imagined. And somehow, Kaya Zilara was at the heart of it all. As the twin suns of Axion began to set, casting long shadows across the alien landscape, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival here was the beginning of something much larger than just a diplomatic mission. Something that would test not only his skills, but his heart, and perhaps change the fate of both their worlds. The sunless night on Axion cast the world in deep indigo shadows, the strange crystalline formations glowing faintly with their own internal light. Jace walked down a secluded path within the palace gardens, his footsteps nearly silent on the polished stone. It had been days since his initial meeting with Kaya, and though they'd exchanged few words in public, he could feel the magnetic pull between them intensifying with every encounter. Tonight, though, wasn't about flirtation or charm. This meeting would change everything. Kaya had left a message for him, simple and direct. Eastern Gate. Midnight. Now, as he approached the towering, intricately carved gate, Jace's mind raced with 1,000 questions. What did she want from him? Was this a test of loyalty? A trap? He had no allies here. His only defense was his sharp tongue and wit. But still, something in Kaya's stormy eyes had called to him. Something rebellious, restless, like a caged bird desperate to break free. As he rounded the corner, Kaya was already there, waiting for him in the shadows. Her glowing skin was dimmer under the faint light of the crystalline plants, her usual regal robes replaced with simpler dark attire. She looked less like an untouchable figure of authority, and more like a fellow conspirator in a dangerous game. "You're late," Kaya said softly, but there was a flicker of amusement in her tone. "Couldn't risk an intergalactic scandal by rushing," Jace quipped, though his voice was hushed. "Wouldn't want anyone to think we were plotting something." Kaya's gaze was sharp as ever, her gray eyes scanning his face for something deeper. She didn't laugh, but her lips quirked into the faintest smile. Maybe we are. Jace leaned against the cold stone wall, his heart racing. There was no doubt in his mind that this meeting had a purpose far beyond flirtation. You brought me here for a reason, didn't you? Kaya's smile faded, replaced by something more serious, more dangerous. She glanced around, as if expecting spies to emerge from the shadows. My people are on the edge of self-destruction, Jace, she whispered. The High Council clings to outdated traditions, blinded by the fear of outsiders. I've seen what the galaxy has to offer. I've heard the voices that urge for change. But my father, he and the others refuse to listen. Jace tilted his head. And you think I can help? I think you already are, Kaya said, stepping closer. Her towering presence should have felt overwhelming, but instead it only fueled the strange intensity that hummed between them. The Council is scared of you, even if they won't admit it. They fear what you represent, what your people represent. A future where isolation isn't enough to keep us safe anymore. They know it, but they won't act. And what do you want to do, Kaya? Jace asked, his voice low, but not from fear, more like anticipation. I want to save my people, she said, her voice soft but firm. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who understands the game we're playing here, someone who sees past the ceremony and the speeches. Someone like me, Jace said, a grin playing at his lips. You're talking about an alliance. You, me, and maybe a little chaos? Kaya's eyes sparked, a gleam of mischief and danger that mirrored Jace's own. Call it what you want, but if we don't act now, Axion will tear itself apart, or worse, provoke a conflict with your people that neither of us can afford. Jace stood straight, the gravity of the moment sinking in. So, what's the plan? Kaya glanced at him, her lips curving into a smile that was both cunning and magnetic. First, we need to get the younger council members on our side. They're less rigid, more open to the idea of change. Then, we start undermining the power of the old guard. The key is subtlety. We can't afford to provoke a full rebellion, not yet. Jace chuckled, unable to resist the pull of this dangerous game. You make it sound so easy. It won't be, Kaya said, her voice serious once again. But you said it yourself. Maybe a little chaos is exactly what this world needs. For a moment they stood in silence, the air between them thick with the weight of what they were about to set into motion. It was risky. It was reckless. It could cost them everything. And yet Jace felt more alive than he had in years. He offered Kaya his hand, a gesture of partnership. Then let's get to work. Kaya hesitated only for a heartbeat before taking his hand, her grip strong and unyielding. We're in this together now, Jace. No turning back. As they stood there, locked in this dangerous alliance beneath the alien skies of Axion, Jace knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The real game had just begun. And no matter how it ended, nothing would ever be the same again. The nights on Axion seemed longer now, stretching into endless hours of restless thought. Jace had never been one to lose sleep over a mission, but tonight was different. Tonight, his mind was full of her. Kaya. He stood by the wide window of his dimly lit quarters, staring out at the alien landscape. The crystalline trees shimmered in the moonlight, their branches swaying like glowing tendrils in the wind. Axion's twin moons hung heavy in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over the world. It should have been peaceful, but the tension that hummed beneath his skin kept him from feeling anything close to calm. Jace sighed and ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts a chaotic storm. Their alliance was dangerous. He had known that from the moment he'd agreed to it. But what he hadn't anticipated, what he couldn't have foreseen, was how quickly his feelings for Kaya would deepen. It wasn't just her beauty, though that alone was enough to leave most men breathless. It was the way she stood up to her people, the way her defiance simmered beneath the surface, controlled yet fierce. The way her mind worked, sharp and unyielding, challenging him at every turn. She was a force of nature, and he was caught in her orbit, unable or unwilling to break free. There was a soft knock at his door. Jace turned, his pulse quickening. Only one person would come to him at this hour, and the thought of seeing her sent a jolt of anticipation through him. He hesitated for a moment, then crossed the room and opened the door. Kaya stood in the doorway, her tall figure framed by the dim hallway light. Her skin glowed faintly in the shadows, the intricate patterns across her arms and neck pulsing softly with each breath. Her stormy gray eyes, the ones that had haunted his thoughts, locked onto his. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice low and measured, though there was an underlying tension in her words. Jace stepped aside, his heart pounding. "You never need to ask." Kaya slipped inside, moving like a shadow, and the door closed softly behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, emotions that had been simmering for days now, rising to the surface. "I shouldn't be here," Kaya said, her voice barely more than a whisper, her gaze fixed on the floor. "But you are," Jace replied, taking a step closer to her. His hand hovered near her arm, the heat radiating from her skin like a magnet pulling him in. "So why did you come?" Kaya lifted her eyes to meet his, and in that moment, Jace saw the conflict warring within her. Duty, loyalty, tradition, all of it weighed down on her shoulders, threatening to crush her under its oppressive force. But there was something else too. Something raw and undeniable. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Jace's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. He had seen her stand tall in the face of the High Council, argue fiercely against the traditions that bound her people, but here, in this quiet moment, she was something entirely different. She was torn, fragile in her strength, and it stirred something deep inside him. Without thinking, Jace reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm. The contact sent a shockwave through both of them, and Kaya's breath caught in her throat. For a long, tense moment they stood like that, the space between them charged with something electric. "This is madness," Kaya whispered, her voice barely audible. "You know we can't." "Then why are we fighting it?" Jace interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. He stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of her body against his. "Why pretend this doesn't exist?" Kaya looked up at him, her gray eyes wide and vulnerable, and Jace could see the war she was fighting within herself. The part of her that clung to duty, to tradition, was at odds with the part that wanted, needed, something more. And for the first time since he had met her, Jace saw the walls she had built around herself begin to crack. "I've spent my whole life fighting," Kaya said, her voice breaking slightly. "Fighting for my people, for a future they can't even imagine. And now..." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor again. "And now, I'm fighting this. Fighting you, and I don't even know why anymore." Jace lifted his hand, gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing over the soft patterns of her glowing skin. "Then stop fighting," he whispered. "Just stop." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air between them buzzed with tension, thick and suffocating, as if the entire world held its breath. Then, slowly, Kaya closed the distance between them, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was tentative at first, but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more desperate. Jace pulled her closer, his hands tangling in her hair, and for the first time in days, everything else fell away. The mission, the politics, the danger, they all vanished, leaving only the two of them, alone in the quiet dark. But as their kiss intensified, the weight of their reality began to creep back in. This was forbidden. This was dangerous. And yet, Jace couldn't bring himself to care. He had never felt anything like this before. This fire that burned between them, fierce and consuming. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Kaya rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. "This can't happen again," she whispered, though her words lacked conviction. Jace smirked, his hand still resting against her cheek. "We'll see." Kaya laughed softly, a sound that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Then, without another word, she pulled away, stepping back toward the door. Her absence left a cold void where she had stood, and Jace felt the weight of what had just happened settle over him like a shroud. As she slipped out into the hallway, Kaya glanced back at him one last time, her gray eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "Good night, Jace." "Good night, Kaya," he whispered, watching as she disappeared into the darkness, leaving him alone with the storm she had stirred inside him. And in that moment, Jace knew, no matter how hard they tried to fight it, there was no turning back from what they had started. The council chamber, vast and cold, echoed with the low murmur of voices. Jace sat stiffly at the far end of the grand table, flanked by towering Axion officials who barely acknowledged his presence. The ceiling loomed high above, carved with intricate designs that glittered faintly in the dim, otherworldly light. It was a room designed to intimidate, to remind outsiders like him of their insignificance in the presence of the mighty Axion race. But Jace wasn't here to be intimidated. His eyes swept the room, taking in the tense posture of the counselors, the way they shifted uncomfortably in their seats as if something was wrong, something unsettled beneath the surface of their practiced stoicism. It had been weeks since Kaya had pulled him into her dangerous plan to undermine the old guard, and now, after so many secret meetings, whispered words in dark corridors, and stolen moments of passion, Jace could feel the pressure building, as though the entire structure of Axion society was on the verge of cracking. He glanced at Kaya, seated across from him, her expression unreadable. She looked every bit the dignified daughter of the council, composed and regal, her stormy gray eyes fixed straight ahead. But Jace knew better. Behind that mask, she was seething. There had been whispers, rumors of a growing schism within the council. Some of the younger members, the ones Kaya had worked to sway, were beginning to question the leadership. They saw the same flaws in their isolationist policies that she did, saw the cracks that were beginning to show as the rest of the galaxy advanced, leaving Axion behind. Yet, for all the small victories they'd won, the true power still lay with the High Council, and at its helm stood Kaya's father, Zevrak, as immovable and unwavering as ever. Jace could feel the tension radiating from Kaya every time her father spoke, his deep voice resonating through the chamber with a weight that silenced dissent. "The issue of interspecies relations will not be discussed further," Zevrak declared, his glowing blue skin pulsing faintly with his rising anger. "We have survived millennia by preserving our purity, by keeping our traditions intact. The galaxy may change around us, but we will remain steadfast. This is not a matter for debate." Kaya stiffened, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. Jace could feel the weight of her frustration like a tangible force in the air. She had been pushing for cultural exchange, for the Axions to open their borders and embrace new alliances with other species, but the High Council's resistance was as strong as ever. Jace leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "With all due respect, Counselor Zevrak, isolation might have served your people in the past, but the galaxy is shifting. There are threats on the horizon, forces far greater than any of us can predict. The longer Axion clings to old ways, the more vulnerable you become." Zevrak turned his cold, pupilless gaze on Jace, his lips curling in disdain. "And what would a human know of our ways? Your people are reckless, impulsive. You lack the discipline that has sustained our civilization for millennia. We do not need outsiders meddling in our affairs." Jace felt the sting of Zevrak's words, but he refused to back down. He had expected resistance. He had expected hostility. But beneath the counselor's bluster, Jace sensed something else. Fear. Before Jace could respond, Kaya stood, her voice sharp and cutting through the tension like a whip. "We cannot afford to bury our heads in the sand, Father. Times have changed. Our people are not the same as they were centuries ago, and neither is the galaxy. If we refuse to adapt, we will become relics of a past long forgotten." Zevrak's gaze hardened, his glowing skin pulsing brighter as his anger flared. "You speak out of turn, Kaya," he growled. "This council has ruled for generations. We do not bend to the whims of the young or to the interference of outsiders." The air in the chamber crackled with tension. Jace watched Kaya, admiring the way she stood tall, unyielding despite the weight of her father's authority bearing down on her. She had never been afraid to speak her mind, never wavered in her belief that her people deserved more than the narrow path they had been forced to walk. But today, Jace sensed something different in her. A determination that went beyond her usual defiance. There was something more at play here, something he hadn't fully grasped until now. Kaya took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the room before landing back on her father. "You're afraid, Father. You're afraid of losing control, of watching the world you've built crumble under the weight of its own stubbornness. But you can't stop what's coming." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even Jace felt the shock ripple through him at her boldness. Zevrak's face twisted with barely contained rage, but before he could respond, another voice spoke up. Counselor Threx, one of the younger members Kaya had been working to win over. "Perhaps Kaya is right," Threx said, his voice tentative but growing stronger with each word. "Perhaps it is time we reconsider our stance on isolation. The galaxy is changing, and we must change with it." Zevrak's eyes flared, but Jace saw the flicker of uncertainty pass through the council. It was working. The cracks were widening. The old guard was losing its grip. But then, just as Jace began to feel a surge of hope, a heavy thud echoed through the chamber doors. The sound of armored boots reverberated down the hall, growing louder with each step. The doors burst open, and a squad of Axion guards marched in, their weapons gleaming under the dim light. At their helm stood one of Zevrak's most loyal enforcers, a brute named Varrock, his expression as cold and unyielding as the stone walls around them. "What is the meaning of this?" Kaya demanded, her voice rising with alarm. Varrock stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Jace. "By order of the High Council, the human ambassador is to be taken into custody, effective immediately." Jace felt a chill run down his spine. He had been prepared for resistance. But this was something else. They were making their move, and he was their target. Kaya stepped between Jace and the guards, her voice fierce with outrage. "You have no right. This is a diplomatic mission, sanctioned by the Council." But Varrock only sneered, his gaze flickering toward Zevrak, who sat silent and unmoved. The council has deemed the ambassador a threat to the stability of Axion. He will be detained until further notice. Jace's mind raced, but there was no time to protest. Before he could react, the guards closed in around him, their hands gripping his arms with iron strength. As they dragged him toward the door, he locked eyes with Kaya one last time. "Jace?" she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. But Jace only smiled, a small, defiant grin that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't over. As the door slammed shut behind him, Jace knew that the real fight had just begun. The cold steel walls of the cell were suffocating, pressing in on Jace from all sides. He had been locked away for what felt like days, though time had blurred into a dull, oppressive monotony since the moment the doors slammed shut behind him. The Axion guards hadn't bothered to explain his arrest. No charges, no trial, just silence. It was clear enough to him, though. He was a scapegoat, a convenient target for the High Council to maintain control in a society teetering on the edge of change. He paced the small space, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, frustration, and fear. Not for himself, but for Kaya. He had seen the way Zevrak looked at her during the last council meeting, the way his authority had faltered under the weight of her words. The council was beginning to fracture, and Jace knew that his arrest was not just about silencing him. It was about isolating Kaya, cutting her off from the only person who stood with her against the old guard. But Kaya was strong. He knew that. She had spent her whole life fighting battles far bigger than this, battles within herself, within her people. Still, he couldn't shake the gnawing worry that she was alone now, facing the wrath of her father and the growing suspicions of the council. What would they do to her? Would they strip her of her status, imprison her like they had him? The thought was like a knife twisting in his gut. Just as his frustration boiled over, the heavy steel door creaked open. Jace froze, his heart pounding as a familiar figure stepped into the dim light. Kaya. She looked different. The defiance that usually radiated from her was dimmed, replaced by a wariness that seemed to weigh her down. Her glowing blue skin seemed duller. Her gray eyes clouded with emotions she rarely allowed to surface. Without a word, she crossed the room in long, silent strides. Jace opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, she threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There were no words for the fear, the frustration, the heartache that had been building between them. They simply held on to each other, as if afraid that letting go would make the world outside all too real. When Kaya finally pulled back, her eyes met his, and Jace could see the storm swirling within her. "They're calling me a traitor," she whispered, her voice trembling with a vulnerability she rarely let show. "My own people, Jace. They're saying I've betrayed everything we stand for by aligning myself with you." Jace's heart clenched. He had expected this, expected the council to turn on her the moment they found a way to exploit their relationship. But hearing the words from her lips made the situation all the more real and all the more painful. "And you?" Jace asked softly, his hands still resting on her arms. "What do you believe?" Kaya closed her eyes, taking a slow, shaky breath. "I don't know anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's right or what's wrong. All I know is that I can't stand by and let my people destroy themselves. I can't let my father bury us in the past." Jace reached up, gently cupping her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You're not a traitor, Kaya. You're the only one fighting for a future worth living in." A tear slipped down Kaya's cheek, something Jace had never seen before. She had always been so strong, so unyielding. But now, standing here in the dim light of his cell, the weight of everything seemed to crash down on her all at once. "I don't care what they say about me," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But I care about what happens to you. They're saying you've manipulated me, that you've used our relationship to undermine the council. They want to send you back to Earth in disgrace, strip you of your position, make sure you never step foot on Axion again." Jace's jaw clenched. Of course they would. He had always been an outsider, a convenient scapegoat for their fear of change. But he couldn't leave, not like this. Not when Kaya was standing on the precipice of losing everything. He couldn't abandon her now. "And what about us?" Jace asked quietly, his heart pounding. "What do we do?" Kaya shook her head, her lips trembling as she spoke. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how to fight this anymore. I've tried to change things from within, but now I'm the one they're turning against." "They're scared of you," Jace said, his voice firm. "Scared of what you represent. You've shown them that there's another way and they hate you for it." Kaya's eyes darkened, her gaze hardening. "Then maybe it's time I stopped playing their game." Maybe it's time we stop trying to fit into their rules. Jace's heart skipped a beat. There was something dangerous in her voice now, a fire that he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just defiance, it was resolve. "What are you saying, Kaya?" Jace asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm saying we fight," she replied, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "Not with politics, not with words, we make them listen, we make them see." For a moment, the gravity of her words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. They had crossed a line, one they couldn't uncross. Their relationship had been the spark that ignited the fire, but now the flames were spreading, and there was no going back. Jace nodded slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "Then we fight." Kaya leaned in, her lips brushing against his, in a kiss that was both desperate and full of promise. A promise that whatever happened next, they would face it together. As they pulled apart, Kaya's eyes shone with determination. This is only the beginning. Jace's heart raced as he watched her disappear into the shadows, the echo of her footsteps fading into the darkness. He knew that whatever came next would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. They were no longer just lovers. They were traitors. The shuttle's engines roared to life, sending a low hum through the floor as Jace sat in silence, staring out at the sprawling landscape of Axion for what he knew might be the last time. The endless valleys of glowing crystalline trees stretched out beneath the twin suns, the light casting long shadows over a world that had been his home, his battleground, and the place where he had lost and found everything. The cold reality of the shuttle walls pressed against him, but his mind was far from the confines of this ship. It lingered in the palace gardens, in the quiet corridors where he had first met Kaya. His thoughts spun through the last few days, each moment playing out in slow, painful detail. The weight of everything they had fought for, the love they had risked, the rebellion they had sparked, felt both heavy and unfinished. The sound of the doors opening jolted him from his thoughts. Kaya stepped into the small compartment, her regal figure as imposing as ever. But today, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that he had rarely seen, a crack in the armor she so carefully maintained. Her skin glowed with that familiar luminescence, but it was dimmer now, dulled by the exhaustion and the impossible decisions they had made. She didn't say anything at first, simply standing there in the doorway, as if struggling to find the right words. Jace rose to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as he crossed the distance between them, closing the gap that had never felt wider than it did now. "I thought you wouldn't come," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Kaya's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes shimmering with something unspoken. "I wasn't sure I should." Jace's heart clenched painfully in his chest. He had prepared himself for this moment, knowing that what they had built here, whatever it was, might never survive what came next. He had imagined the end, rehearsed 1,000 goodbyes in his head, but nothing could have prepared him for the look in her eyes. "You have to go, Jace," Kaya said quietly, the words heavy, each one a stone drop between them. "It's the only way." Jace clenched his fists at his sides, his body aching with the desire to pull her close, to tell her they could still find a way out of this. But he knew. Deep down, he knew there was no escape, not from the reality they had created, not from the forces tearing them apart. "You could come with me," Jace said softly, his voice a plea. "We could leave all of this behind, start somewhere new, together." Kaya's eyes closed briefly, as if the idea were too painful to even consider. When she opened them again, her gaze was fierce, resolute. "And abandon my people? No, I can't, I won't. If I leave, everything we've fought for will be destroyed. The council will crush the rebellion, and my father will win." Jace swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had known this was coming, known that Kaya's loyalty to her people would always outweigh her love for him, but knowing didn't make it any easier. "I can't stay here," he said, his voice hoarse. "You know that." Kaya nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know, but you can still do something. Go back to Earth, tell them what's happening here, keep the pressure on, force the council's hand. It's the only way we have a chance." Jace nodded, though the words felt hollow. He didn't want to leave. Not like this. Kaya stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his face. The warmth of her skin, the faint glow that radiated from her, had always been a comfort to him, a reminder of the impossible beauty of the bond they had forged. And now, it felt like a final touch, a memory slipping through his fingers. "This isn't goodbye, Jace," Kaya whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not done yet. This is just another battle, another step in the fight. We'll see each other again." Jace pulled her into a fierce embrace, his arms wrapping around her as if holding on could stop the inevitable. He buried his face in her neck, breathing her in, memorizing every detail of her before she slipped away from him. The smell of her skin, the way her body fit perfectly against his. It was all he had left of her now. "I love you," Jace whispered into the silence, his words barely more than a breath. Kaya pulled back, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. She placed her hand on his chest where his heart thundered beneath his skin, and smiled. Soft, sad, but filled with a fierce determination that had always drawn him to her. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But right now, we have to fight for something bigger than us." Jace nodded, though the ache in his chest only deepened. He had known it all along. Their love was a beautiful, impossible thing. One that could never be contained by the rules of two worlds at war. Kaya pressed her lips to his one last time, the kiss full of everything they hadn't said, everything they couldn't say. And then, she was gone, slipping out of his arms and into the shadows, leaving him standing alone in the shuttle, the empty space where she had been a raw, gaping wound. The engines roared to life again, and the shuttle lifted off, the landscape of Axion falling away beneath him as the stars stretched out in endless shimmering lines. Jace leaned his head back against the cold seat, his hands gripping the armrests as the weight of everything settled over him. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. They had started something. A fire that wouldn't be extinguished by distance or politics or the weight of the universe pressing down on them. Somewhere out there, across the stars, Kaya was still fighting. And Jace? He'd fight too. He'd tear down the walls that separated their worlds, brick by brick, until the gap was bridged and the future they had dreamed of was no longer just a dream. As the stars streaked by, Jace allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. This wasn't goodbye. It was only the beginning.